The morning of June 12, 1944, dawned grey and heavy over the hedgerows of Normandy. Mist clung to the fields, thick as smoke, muffling the distant thud of artillery. In a ruined farmhouse outside Carentan, the cries of wounded soldiers mixed with the rattle of stretchers and the hiss of morphine syringes. A Red Cross flag splattered with mud fluttered from a shattered window. Beneath it, American medics worked in silence, faces streaked with grime, hands steady, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Somewhere outside, German mortars still probed the roads, but inside that makeshift hospital, war's chaos was being held back by order, discipline, and something close to mercy. Hours earlier, a group of captured German medics had been marched through the same fields under guard. They expected to see crude shelters and bloodied chaos, the kind of field stations they knew from the Eastern Front. Instead, what they found stopped them cold. Rows of tents arranged with mathematical precision, clean linen, electric lamps powered by portable generators, instruments sterilized, catalogued and wrapped. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a small city of healing carved into the mud. One prisoner whispered, astonished, "Das ist ein Krankenhaus, kein Lager." This is a hospital, not a camp. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to patching wounds in barns or roadside ditches, the sight was unsettling. These Americans seemed to bring their civilization with them, even into hell. The efficiency bordered on arrogance. How could a nation fighting across oceans maintain hospitals so close to the front line and so clean? That question would linger long after D-Day, as German medical officers began filing their own quiet reports of disbelief. The truth was that these hospitals were not miracles. They were the product of planning that had begun years earlier, long before a single Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches of France. In 1940, while Europe burned, the U.S. Army Medical Department had begun reimagining battlefield medicine. Colonel Norman T. Kirk and Surgeon General James McGee insisted that modern war demanded modern healing. They envisioned field hospitals that could move with the front line, deploy in hours, and treat everything from shrapnel wounds to chest surgery. American industry listened. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Becton Dickinson, and Westinghouse began producing modular medical kits, portable X-ray machines, and sterilization units designed for combat zones. By 1943, these innovations had formed into something entirely new: the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, a prototype that could unfold from crates into a functioning theater of war medicine. It could operate within 10 miles of the fighting, staffed by surgeons trained not just in hospitals, but in trauma under fire. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of older European medical corps, American units encouraged initiative. A sergeant might direct triage. A lieutenant could improvise an operating table from a door and crates. Every soldier knew their role. Every tool had a place. When the Normandy invasion began, this system was put to its first true test. The landings flooded the medical corps with casualties faster than any plan had predicted. Thousands of men torn by shrapnel, burned, concussed, broken. Yet within 48 hours, the first surgical tents were operational. Blood plasma, flown in from England and stored in portable refrigeration units, became a lifeline. American medics could transfuse within minutes, a practice still rare among Axis forces. The use of penicillin, distributed in mass quantities through U.S. Army medical supply depots, changed survival rates overnight. A wound that meant amputation for a German soldier often healed cleanly under Allied care. The German prisoners watched, as men who should have died returned to the line in days. The Americans seemed to cheat death itself, not by miracle but by method. Even small details spoke volumes. Every patient was tagged, charted and tracked, every instrument accounted for. The hospitals had lighting bright enough for midnight surgeries. Generators hummed in rhythm, feeding power through rubberized cables. The nurses, many from civilian hospitals back home, worked in khaki instead of white, but their precision was surgical theater perfection. What the German medics didn't know was how deep the American logistics machine ran. Behind every field hospital was an entire lattice of depots, warehouses, and hospital ships stretching back to England. A single division in France could draw on hundreds of tons of medical equipment, restocked daily by convoys of trucks and amphibious craft. Engineers from the Corps of Engineers and Signal Corps laid communication lines to connect these hospitals to command networks, allowing them to request supplies or air evacuations instantly. It was not just medicine, it was the industrialization of compassion. And yet the scene was not without horror. The surgeons worked elbow-deep in blood, their faces ghostly under the electric light. Outside, stretcher-bearers moved through rain and gunfire to retrieve the fallen. The groans of the wounded mixed with the distant crack of rifle fire. A medic, barely 20, whispered a prayer over each man before pushing another needle into a vein. They were not immune to fear. They simply refused to let it dictate the outcome. By the third day after D-Day, word of these miracle hospitals reached both Allied command and German intelligence. Some Wehrmacht officers dismissed the reports as propaganda, but as more prisoners were captured and interrogated, the accounts aligned. The Americans were performing complex surgeries within artillery range, and their wounded were surviving at unprecedented rates. One officer, according to his field diary, wrote that if the Allies could sustain this pace, their armies would bleed slower and fight longer. Behind every tent stood the unseen heroes, engineers, electricians, and logisticians who made the impossible possible. Westinghouse technicians ensured the generators never failed. Quartermaster engineers built water purification systems that kept infections low. Even the canvas of the tents had been chemically treated against mildew and gas contamination. The system was built with layers of foresight, each link designed to survive chaos. It was war fought with science and heart alike. German medics began to take notes. Some asked permission to observe. When allowed, they watched in silence as surgeons worked with instruments they had never seen, rotating lights, suction pumps, anesthesia delivery units. They left shaking their heads, wondering how an army could fight so far from home yet bring hospitals that rivaled their homeland's best. As night fell on the hedgerows, the rain thickened again. In the distance, artillery thundered like an approaching storm. Inside the tents, the glow of surgery lights cut through the dark, steady and relentless. The battle outside might rage for days, but within those canvas walls, another battle was being fought, one against infection, time, and despair. And the Americans somehow were winning both. But as reports reached Berlin and the German High Command began to grasp what they were facing, questions emerged. How had the Allies mastered mobile medicine so completely? What hidden infrastructure or innovation lay behind these miracles in the mud? And more chilling still, if this was how the Americans cared for their wounded, what else were they capable of on the battlefield? The answer, when it finally came, would leave German officers not just shocked, but terrified of what industrialized medicine could mean for total war. The shock among German field medics was not superstition, it was calculation. They knew medicine, they understood logistics, and yet the scale of what they witnessed along the Normandy front defied military logic. Within days of the landings, reports filtered through Wehrmacht medical channels describing a strange new phenomenon. The Americans appeared to have a hospital shadow moving behind every assault column. To German command, this seemed impossible. To American planners, it was the result of years of deliberate innovation hidden beneath the surface of their war machine. The secret lay in mobility and in metal. By 1942, the U.S. Army had commissioned a new generation of medical transport vehicles built from lessons learned in North Africa. General Electric's design bureaus developed portable sterilizers powered by compact electric generators, while Dodge engineers reconfigured standard 3-4-ton trucks into rolling operating theaters. Each vehicle carried collapsible surgical tables, sterilized tools, and even battery-powered suction pumps. The Army designated them as part of the portable surgical hospital concept, a radical leap from the static systems of World War I. These units could unfold from crates into a full surgical suite in under 3 hours. The sterilizers could reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit and process 40 instruments per cycle. Operating lamps used compact carbon filament bulbs resistant to vibration. an invention credited to engineers at Westinghouse in 1943. Every wire, bolt and clamp had been tested to survive the shock of artillery concussions. While German medics relied on kerosene lamps and boiling kettles, the Americans wielded sterilized steel and steady light. Blood, however, was the true miracle fluid. Under the supervision of Dr. Charles Drew's earlier innovations in plasma storage, the American Medical Department had perfected large-scale refrigeration and transport. Each 5-gallon drum of plasma could serve dozens of transfusions and remain viable for weeks in mobile coolers powered by generators designed by Carrier Corporation. When German doctors first saw these drums near St. Lo, they mistook them for fuel containers. The realization that they held life instead of gasoline stunned them. They had no equivalent. Even the paper trail astonished observers. Every wounded soldier carried a medical emergency tag coded with details of injury, treatment, and time logged to the minute. In some hospitals, these tags were radio transmitted back to command posts through shortwave sets built by Motorola. It was not just triage, it was data management under fire. For the Wehrmacht, whose reporting still relied on couriers, this degree of coordination was science fiction. As the Americans pushed inland, the full potential of this system was tested near the small town of Mortain in August 1944. The 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, had been cut off by a fierce German counterattack supported by panzer divisions. Casualties mounted rapidly, over 300 men wounded within hours. Artillery fire made evacuation impossible. Under such conditions, conventional armies would accept catastrophic loss. Instead, the U.S. Medical Corps unfolded its hidden strength. Within 6 hours, the 42nd Portable Surgical Hospital convoy reached the perimeter. Engineers set up tents under enemy fire, driving stakes into soaked earth while shells landed within a mile. A generator trailer roared to life, feeding power to lamps and refrigeration units. Surgeons, led by Major Ellis B. Hall, began operations by 1400 hours. They performed 24 major surgeries that day, amputations, abdominal repairs, arterial closures, without losing a single patient on the table. When German artillery cut power lines, technicians spliced new ones in minutes. Blood plasma kept flowing. From the opposite ridge, captured German observers reported disbelief. Through binoculars, they could see surgical tents operating while smoke from artillery drifted overhead. One noted that the Americans seemed impervious to chaos, as if their hospitals carried their own weather. Their own casualty stations, by comparison, were forced to retreat or collapse under bombardment. The Americans stayed and worked. Part of this resilience came from the design of their supply chains. The medical department's chain evacuation system, first tested in Sicily, allowed wounded soldiers to move seamlessly through 4 levels of care: battalion aid, collecting station, field hospital, and evacuation hospital. Each link was supported by vehicles and aircraft configured for medical use. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain aircraft, nicknamed Flying Hospitals, carried up to 18 stretchers and 3 medical attendants. They operated around the clock, guided by radio beacons from forward airstrips. To the Germans, this air evacuation network seemed an absurd luxury, until they saw its effect. Wounded Americans who would have died of infection in 2 days were recovering in England within 24 hours. Technically, the Americans were solving an engineering problem: how to turn time into survival. Every hour a man spent untreated reduced his chance of living by nearly 10%. The mobile surgical hospitals closed that gap with mathematics and machinery. The sterilizers cycled every 15 minutes. The blood refrigeration units maintained a steady 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and portable autoclaves sterilized gauze faster than any German equivalent. Engineers in the Quartermaster Corps even designed collapsible water purification systems that could filter 5,000 gallons per day, enough to supply both surgery and sanitation for a full division. But the most unsettling revelation for German medics came from the human side of the system. American doctors rotated through field duty in carefully timed cycles to prevent fatigue. Nurses and orderlies worked in shifts regulated by discipline more familiar to factory floors than battlefields. The army treated medicine as industry, with schedules, redundancies, and performance metrics. Even handwriting was standardized on medical forms for legibility under stress. The result was astonishing consistency. Across dozens of hospitals, procedures looked the same, tools were placed the same way, and outcomes mirrored each other. At Mortain, when German prisoners were treated by American medics, their reactions ranged from gratitude to disbelief. One recalled being ashamed to see such care from the enemy. Another, a Feldwebel medic himself, observed that American surgeons worked as if rehearsed for years. They were not far wrong. The training films distributed by the Army Pictorial Service before D-Day had drilled every medic in protocols down to the position of their scissors. It was medicine choreographed like warfare. The enemy's confusion grew deeper when they realized these systems were not reserved for officers or elite troops. A private from Oklahoma received the same plasma, the same anesthesia, and the same surgeon as a captain. To German observers accustomed to triage based on rank and prognosis, this egalitarian medicine bordered on madness. Yet it reflected a deeper ethos within the U.S. Army, that every soldier was worth saving because every soldier mattered to victory. By the campaign's end, the results were undeniable. American frontline mortality rates fell below 4%, half the German figure. Infection deaths dropped by nearly 80% compared to World War I. At the same time, the speed of returning lightly wounded men to combat helped sustain the momentum of the Allied advance. To the High Command in Berlin, these statistics were more terrifying than any new tank or bomber. They revealed an army whose strength grew with every battle because it refused to let its wounded go. German intelligence officers attempted to decode this advantage. Some suspected a vast underground hospital complex in England. Others thought the Allies were using captured French infrastructure. The truth was simpler and far more frightening. The Americans had mastered mobility, technology, and compassion as instruments of war. And as the front lines rolled toward the German border, a chilling realization spread among Wehrmacht surgeons. If the enemy's hospitals could advance this quickly, what chance did the Reich's wounded have when the tide turned east? The answer would come soon enough, as the Americans brought their healing machine into Germany itself, and forced even hardened SS medics to confront the scale of what modern war medicine could achieve. By the winter of 1944, the American field hospitals had become an empire of their own, an invisible network stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the snowbound forests of the Ardennes. They moved like organisms, folding and unfolding across the continent with the precision of a living machine. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December, German intelligence once again underestimated how fast the U.S. Army could react. Panzer divisions struck through the mist, slicing into the Allied lines, expecting chaos. But behind the retreating infantry, the white tents rose again, calm, deliberate, and ready. The Americans were already preparing to absorb the human cost of the counterattack before the first shells had even landed. When German reconnaissance planes captured photographs of these sprawling medical zones, analysts initially mistook them for command posts or supply depots. They couldn't understand why so much energy, manpower, and material were concentrated behind the front. It was only after captured soldiers described the inside, electric lights, cots, refrigeration units, surgical lamps, that the truth sank in. The Allies had weaponized survival. Their soldiers could fight longer, bleed slower, and return faster. The battlefield itself had become a system of regeneration. That system was now self-sustaining. Engineers had refined mobile heating units to keep surgical tents warm even at 10 degrees C. New oxygen compressors made anesthesia more stable, even under fluctuating power loads. Field medics carried individual plasma kits that could be used within minutes of injury. Every advance was recorded, improved, and redistributed across the front within days. The Americans had created a feedback loop of innovation, one that the fragmented German supply system could never replicate. For the Germans, the psychological impact was crushing. Their wounded lay in cold barns or half-collapsed bunkers, treated by overworked medics with dwindling morphine supplies. In contrast, American casualties returned with stories of warm tents, clean bandages, and skilled nurses who knew their names. To soldiers on both sides, It began to feel as if one army cared more deeply for life itself. That belief was more dangerous than any rifle. When the Bulge battle reached its fever pitch around Bastogne, medics of the 326th Airborne Medical Company set up an operating station in a cellar beneath a shattered convent. Snow blew through the broken windows. Outside, the 101st Airborne held the perimeter against overwhelming German attacks. Inside, the medics performed surgery by the light of gasoline lanterns and generator bulbs, their faces ghostly in the smoke. Each operation was a small act of defiance. The Germans surrounding them could not believe that the Americans were still performing complex surgeries under siege. But they were, and they succeeded. Over 700 men passed through that cellar. More than 500 lived. What made this possible was not only equipment, but an unbroken chain of logistics. Quartermaster units plowed through snow to deliver fuel, bandages, and penicillin. Radio operators relayed coordinates to air supply pilots, who dropped surgical gear in canisters, marked with red crosses. The system was so resilient that even under encirclement, the Americans kept their medical rhythm. Each wound treated, each soldier saved, became a small victory against despair. As the war turned and Allied armies rolled into Germany, the contrast became unbearable for many in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. In captured German hospitals, American doctors were appalled by what they found: bare floors, blood-soaked straw, and instruments that had not been sterilized in days. For German medics, witnessing the American hospitals firsthand was like seeing the future while living in the past. One recalled years later that he had never understood how much organization could be a kind of mercy. By 1945, the U.S. Army's medical service had treated more than 12 million soldiers. Over 96% of the wounded who reached a field hospital survived. The mortality rate from infection had fallen to levels unimaginable just a decade earlier. Behind those numbers stood not just doctors and nurses, but an entire army of mechanics, chemists, and engineers. The sterilization units came from General Electric's precision metal workers, the generators from Chrysler's plant in Detroit, the plasma coolers from Carrier engineers, who once built air conditioners for department stores. In every piece of machinery, American industry had built compassion into steel. The psychological effects on German prisoners were well documented in Allied intelligence summaries. Many described their disbelief at being treated by their captors with more care than they had received from their own side. Some even volunteered medical observations to assist their American counterparts, out of respect. For men raised in the brutal code of total war, the concept of healing the enemy was almost incomprehensible. Yet these moments of shared humanity became some of the most enduring memories of the Western Front. Strategically, the American field hospital network became a force multiplier. Commanders could plan offensives with greater confidence, knowing their wounded would not vanish into chaos. Morale rose accordingly. Soldiers wrote home describing how quickly they were cared for, how organized everything seemed, how the doctors worked like soldiers. That faith in the system strengthened discipline. In modern warfare, belief could be as decisive as ammunition. German morale, on the other hand, began to crumble. Medical officers warned command that their own treatment infrastructure was collapsing. Supplies were scarce, hospitals overcrowded, and doctors drafted into combat roles. The contrast between the two systems was stark. One evolved through foresight and innovation, the other strangled by exhaustion and fragmentation. To German analysts, the lesson was clear. The Americans were not merely winning through firepower. They were winning through endurance. As the war ended and the rubble settled, those same American doctors and engineers became the architects of a new doctrine that would shape the second half of the 20th century. The lessons of the field hospitals flowed into Korea, into Vietnam, and eventually into the deserts of Iraq. Mobile surgery, air evacuation, triage networks, all descended from the muddy tents of Normandy. The methods pioneered there evolved into the modern concept of forward surgical care, a principle that defines combat medicine to this day. But beyond the charts and protocols, something deeper endured. The German medics who had once walked through the American hospital camps never forgot what they saw. Many wrote later that it changed how they thought about medicine itself, not just as duty, but as defiance. In the ruins of Europe, some would go on to rebuild hospitals modeled after what they had witnessed in France. Healing, they realized, was not the opposite of war. It was proof that even in its darkest hour, humanity refused to vanish. As the last winter of the war faded, the white tents came down for the final time. The fields where they had stood filled with grass and silence. But their legacy remained, etched not only in military manuals and medical textbooks, but in the memories of men who survived because strangers refused to let them die. In the end, it was not just the tanks, the bombers, or the codebreakers that defined American strength. It was the conviction that life itself was worth fighting for and worth saving, even in the middle of destruction. The German medics, standing amid the wreckage of their retreat, could only watch as the Americans carried that conviction forward into history. And as one captured doctor reportedly murmured while watching an American surgical team at work near Cologne, "They are not conquering us with bullets. They are conquering us with mercy."